Despite that opening, I'm the Dean of the Bass School, Arts, Humanities, and Technology, but we do have our struggles sometimes with technology ourselves. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to campus into this year's Einspruch lecture. My first job is a fairly easy one. I'm going to be introducing our provost, Dr. Inga Massemann, to the stage.
Well, thank you, Dr. Romer, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our campus for the Burton C. Einspruch Holocaust Lectures. I first want to acknowledge that we have here today members of the Advisory Council. Would you please raise your hand? Here we go. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Their willingness to attend events, speak to our classes, and share their personal stories help the Ackerman Center continue to excel in the study of the Holocaust. Those stories have so much value, but they point to a concerning fact, that is, we're running out of time. We're running out of time in our ability to hear firsthand accounts about the Holocaust. It has been nearly 80 years since the end of World War II ended and the survivors were freed from the concentration camps, and it is inevitable, with just about any major historical event, the sands of time gradually cloud memories and eventually rob us of the privilege of learning from the people who experienced it directly. That is why the Ackerman Center continues to be so important to UT Dallas and the community, with its motto of teaching the past, changing the future. The center's mission is to educate students about the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies, and to promote solutions to global justice and peace. It is designed to preserve memories and prevent the truths of the Holocaust from ever being forgotten. One of the ways it accomplishes that goal is with the Holocaust Studies program, a beacon of scholarship and enlightenment at UT Dallas since 1986. The program even predates my arrival at UT Dallas, and I have been here for more than 32 years. I have enjoyed watching the program grow and prosper as it continues to embrace the vision of its founder, Holocaust survivor and scholar, Dr. Zsuzsanna Oshvath. Just as the Ackerman Center is a key part of UT Dallas, the Einspruch Lectures have long been a key feature of the Ackerman Center. The Einspruch series has been in place, or had been in place, for 9 years before its endowment was established in 2002. This lecture series has attracted many renowned scholars and prominent figures to share their Holocaust stories and studies. We make this forum open to the public because we want students and general audiences alike to gain insight into the groundbreaking research in the field. It is an important quest, and it is worth the time, because time is of the essence. I would now like to welcome Dr. Romer back to the podium to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stacy Gallin.
Before I get to introduce our speaker, I get to introduce or show actually a very short video about the man himself who actually created the Einspruch lecture. We celebrated him a little over a year ago with a leadership award that he was the worthy recipient, but we have created for that purpose a little video that really tells a little bit about his motivation to create this endowment that has really enabled to bring this incredible lineup of scholars. You just saw it in the slide before. To this day, when you look down the names here, it makes up a formidable reading list for any kind of field exams that any student may want to take. So they're all there, and we're every year adding on yet another incredible individual to that list. But let's start maybe with that short video.
We lived in the Bronx, which is essentially a nice, peaceful, attractive place to be for me as a little boy. Lived close to the park, lived across the street from the school, up until the 40s. The war froze everything, and my father had planned to move down here, seeing how the other part of the family was doing well. So it really was for economic improvement and to join our family. We just played and enjoyed ourselves and listened to a lot of radio. It really was a continuation of a different idyll, but it was idyllic nonetheless. I was 16 when I graduated, and I continued another version of Highland Park, which was SMU. Service, I was commissioned in 1956, and then in '64, they greeted me into going on active duty for 2 years.
I was writing a paper while I was in the military in Philadelphia, and there was a crate on the floor of the library. And it was partially pried open, so I pried the rest of it open just out of curiosity. And what it was the complete Nuremberg trials. So I just reached in and picked up a volume and began to read, and I realized this is more horrific than I even thought, worse than I ever thought. When I left the military, I went to the acting head, and I told him in my adult life I've never stolen anything, and very little in my youth, but I do have volume 1 of the Nuremberg trials. And he said, you keep it, because you'll do something good with it. So I realized that this was the only program I heard of, and that this had the potential of doing something. I met Georgine, she was a very good teacher. This is the early 1990s, and the overall knowledge of the Holocaust had become somewhat polluted and co-opted by Hollywood. But the way Georgine taught it was really truthfully what happened. So I thought somebody who really knew something about it ought to be supported both financially and with some structural help, which I could do. And so I became more involved. And in those years, it was very difficult. I was raising $25 at a time, step by step, able to raise some money and get some presence, have good speakers, attract more students, and even have geographical space. And that's how it took off. The program has increased its importance and its viability, and also its effectiveness. You know, I've been on lots and lots of boards, both philanthropic and business, but this to me is in an odd way more real. Being on a board where one widget more makes a little more profit doesn't interest me. This is something that comes closer to my heart because it's a value not just to Jews, not just to people who survived the Holocaust, but to everyone. My favorite thing is that it's here. My favorite thing also is that there's some very nice people here that I've had the pleasure of working with, administrative people, professorial people, supporters, some of the graduate students, and that's my favorite thing.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, but before I do so, I just noticed when he was mentioning that very volume from the Nuremberg trial, you already just responded, because a lot of what possibly you're also going to be talking today about is really tied to the importance of the Nuremberg trial, also in its long-lasting impact on methical research and ethics. But maybe before I go there, I should introduce you, if my face recognition works here. Yes, it does. So Dr. Stacy Gallin is a prominent figure in the field of bioethics, human rights, and Holocaust studies. She holds a doctorate in medical humanities. When I saw the abbreviation the first time, D.M.H, we were all like, what is that? And then we figured it out, and we thought, how appropriate, how brilliant. So there is a doctorate in medical humanities, and has dedicated her career to exploring the ethical implications of the Holocaust on modern medicine and human rights. So it's not just looking back, but really looking also at the legacy and its lasting impact. Dr. Gallin is the founder and director of the Benjamin Ferencz Institute for Ethics, Human Rights, and the Holocaust, formerly the Maimonides Institute, for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust. And she's also the director of the Center to Combat Anti-Semitism and Reinforce Multicultural Acceptance in New Jersey. She is a widely known author, contributor to many news papers and outlets, and also co-edited Bioethics and the Holocaust, a comprehensive study in how the Holocaust continues to shape the ethics of health, medicine, and human rights, along with numerous articles. If you just go on Google search, it can keep you busy for a while, just kind of keeping track of her many publications. The two things that stand out for me that jump out of many things that she has published is, on the one side, really this kind of lasting impact, and you call it the inflection point, that the legacy of the Holocaust is really an inflection point for rethinking medical ethics. And you're probably going to talk more about this. But the other one that I also just jumped across again this morning was, I think you call it the medical sanctioned genocide. And to me, when you really spell this out slowly and we really wrap your mind around it, it just really illustrates very clearly that the experts, so to speak, were not coincidentally collaborating. They had not just simply stood by or quietly participated, but the experts, in this case, the physicians, had actually medically sanctioned the genocide as the prescription to an illness that race ideology had identified. And therefore, they fall into this category of what German scholars many, many years had called like the Vordenker, the thinkers that had put really the thought about the possibility of something like the Holocaust in the minds not just of committed ideologues, but really of the experts across the different disciplines and fields of knowledge, amongst them also medicine. So please join me all and welcome Stacy to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It is an absolute honor to be here as part of this lecture series, and also to be part of such an impressive list of past speakers. In addition, it is quite fortuitous to see that video, because I will be talking about the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, and I will be using quotes from the actual doctor's trial. I'd love to tell you that my words are powerful and important. Sometimes they are, but I believe that the words of the survivors themselves are much more important than anything that I have to say. And unfortunately, we are at a time in history now when there are not many survivors left to tell these stories. So we really have to make sure that we do our part. We do our part to ensure that those stories get passed on. It's up to us to preserve those legacies, particularly in a world with anti-Semitism on the rise globally, with things that we're seeing now, unprecedented levels, things that we have not seen since the 1930s. So we have to tell these stories. We have to make sure that we don't let history repeat itself. The motto of the Benjamin Ferencz Institute is remember the past, change the future, protect the future. Remember the past, protect the future. And I think it's more important now than ever that we use the lessons of the past to help create ethical leaders who understand what our responsibility is. So we're gonna talk about the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, and we're gonna talk about what that means in terms of it serving as an inflection point, as you said. What does that mean? What was the importance of the doctor's trial? As we all know, we know what a trial is, right? We know what is the purpose of a trial, typically. But the doctor's trial was different. When we talk about the history of medical professional ethics, the Holocaust and its immediate aftermath serve as a unique point, a unique turning point, where ethical standards in medicine and research went from being something that was internal to the medical profession to something that became the subject of society at large. All of a sudden, it wasn't something that was ever spoken about. It wasn't something that society knew very much about. Doctors have often been held in this very high regard, right? We don't question doctors. We just trust that what they say is true, right? You go to a doctor tells you that there's something wrong with you, they tell you what to do, and you believe them. And you trust that they have your best interest at heart. But what happened at the doctor's trial is that we learned that doctors were perpetrators during the Holocaust. That doctors, and here what we saw was 23 leading German physicians and administrators were put on trial for their willing participation in war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? We invented a new term, this idea of crimes against humanity, because we couldn't trust the doctors. The doctors were not these, we just went along with it. No, they were leading the way in the labeling, persecution, and eventual mass murder of millions of people who were deemed unfit. And most people assume, when you hear about the Holocaust, that it was the killing of the Jews. But that's not how it started. It started with the killing of disabled children. I'm going to repeat that, as I will again tomorrow, because it's really important to understand. It started with the labeling and the killing of disabled children by doctors, those who took an oath to heal, okay? So what do you do with that? What do you do with that knowledge? You put the doctors on trial, okay? 85 witnesses, 1,471 documents, and 11,538 pages of transcripts. And all I'm going to say is, I'm not saying that it's okay to steal things either, but yes, take that, make sure that we keep this, make sure that we have all the documentation, make sure you keep the stories, you tell the stories. We need to know what happened. It's important. It's important to keep these stories alive. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what do you do with this information. What was the purpose of the doctor's trial? So the explicit purpose of the doctor's trial, yes, right? We're putting these people on trial. Again, that is the purpose of any trial. But when we talk about what was the deeper purpose, what was the deeper meaning, the nature and the magnitude of this trial, okay, led to the recognition of the need for a universal, international set of standards to ensure that ethical human subject experimentation was the norm, became the norm, so that history never repeated itself, okay? So right, first we're gonna determine the guilt or the innocence of the 23 defendants, and then we're gonna go back and we're gonna try and understand, this has never happened before, so what can we rely on to judge Nazi physicians? How do we ensure physician accountability? Because in the past, that had been something that was internal to the medical profession. Doctors regulated themselves. Other people didn't come in and do it for them. And then we have to talk about what are these questions, what are the appropriate guidelines for human experimentation? But the fifth point is the most important, because the fifth point is when we're going to establish a universal set of ethical principles for human experimentation that would serve as an enforceable code of ethics. That is not something that anyone could have ever imagined a trial doing. That's not the typical way that things are done. So let's talk about the first thing, determining the guilt or innocence of the defendants. Opening statement, we have Brigadier General Telford Taylor, okay? And I told you, I'm gonna use his words, not mine, okay? I'm not gonna read it to you, you can all read it yourselves. But what is he doing here in the opening statement? What is he saying, okay? He's framing the issues. He's talking about the idea that this is not a trial like other trials. He's setting out the multiple tasks that the tribunal has set for itself, okay? But most importantly, what he's saying right here is that Nazi medicine, the ideas and the motives behind Nazi medicine didn't end when World War II did. And that's why it's so important to have this trial. It's not like you can just say, the doctors were guilty, the end, we're gonna punish them, and we won't have to think about this again. He's pointing out, right, that these ideas cannot be killed by force of arms. We can't let them become a spreading cancer, okay? We need to talk about them. We need people to understand what happened, because the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. What these physicians did, this medically sanctioned genocide, this idea that it was the doctors who sanctioned everything, it was their ideas, it was their behavior, they led the way. This needs to be dealt with, okay? This is the key to understanding the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. Every witness, every document, every piece of testimony served a dual purpose. It wasn't just to convict the people who were on trial, it was also to put the ideas themselves on trial. And that's what made the doctor's trial unique. It wasn't just about putting people on trial. It was about putting the ideas themselves on trial, Nazi ideology on trial. So the second thing that this tribunal set out to do is to seek a historical framework of medical ethics from which to accurately judge Nazi physicians. How do you judge this? This has never happened before. What do you do? This is the difficulty in terms of figuring out what is this court faced with, right? And this is really interesting because both the prosecution and the defense used the same argument, right? They used the idea that the history of medical ethics was their argument. So when we look at this, right, the legal strategy here was the same. Each set of lawyers said, okay, well, we're going to use the idea of the history of medical ethics. And we're going to say that it was, each argument that we're going to make is that it was internal ideas for the medical profession to deal with. We deal with this on our own. This is our territory, this is our turf, and we know what we're doing. This is how it's always been done, and this is why you should be guilty, or this is why you shouldn't be guilty. So the prosecution comes into it, and the Americans argue that Nazi physicians violated basic ethical principles historically, first and foremost, right? It's not rocket science to prove the doctors very clearly did not have the patient's best interests at heart. They go through history. They say, obviously, first and foremost, we've got the Hippocratic Oath. This is a blatant violation of the Hippocratic Oath. Then they go through. They have 1803, there's an English physician by the name of Thomas Percival who wrote what was believed to be one of the earliest codes of professional medical ethics. So they say, okay, well, you know, we've got Percival, we've got William Beaumont in 1833. He has a code of ethics that expanded on Percival, and it was the first to include a directive regarding the absolute necessity of voluntary consent. Obviously, Nazi physicians did not ask anyone for voluntary consent. So they say, okay, well, you violated this as well. So here's another reason why you should be considered guilty. William Beaumont, 1833 Code of Ethics expands on that, followed up by Claude Bernard in 1865. He references beneficence and non-maleficence. And he says, okay, now we've got some of the foundational principles of bioethics here. We're building a case. We're building a case here where not only can we say that doctors didn't act in the best interest of the patient, but we can also say that the history of bioethics, here we go, we're building it up, and this is why you are guilty, okay? Except for the fact that Americans did not have any type of code of bioethics. No research ethics, we've got nothing. So a little bit problematic, but okay, fine, we've got it. We've got something on the prosecution side. Then the defense comes in, and the defense says, well, if you've noticed, right, Germany was actually the first people to have medical ethics. Germany was teaching medical ethics as part of mandatory curriculum in medical school. So I don't know what you guys are talking about, but Germany had medical ethics. Now, it might not have been the medical ethics that you're talking about, but you have to look at it in context, right? So also, Germany had the most significant code of medical ethics prior to the Nuremberg Code. It was established in a Reich circular in 1931 and actually included a majority of tenets that were later cited in the Nuremberg Code. So it's ethical. So what are you talking about, right? So you got the prosecution citing their history, you've got the defense citing their history, but the defense basically says something that is very interesting, and the defense says, all of this was legal under German law, okay? So if it was legal under German law, how can you come in after the fact and say it's not legal? How can you change what it means to be legal? So this brings up an interesting point, right? Politics and medicine in Nazi Germany were enmeshed. So the ethical guidelines that they're talking about, when they were established by physicians, but the physicians were part of the government. So there's this idea of the politicization of medicine. And when we talk about medically sanctioned genocide, that's part of what we're talking about. It's this idea that politics can come in and it can influence medical ethics, right? So medical ethics, much like all ethics, does not exist in a vacuum. It can be influenced by outside factors. And that's what we saw happen in Nazi Germany. We saw this idea of ethics. Ethics did exist. That's this big myth that everyone thinks, well, Nazi doctors couldn't possibly have had any type of ethics. How could they have done what they did if they were ethical people? Okay, but define ethics. And that's what the defense is saying. These were ethics. They were our ethics. So how could you come in and say differently? And that becomes this big problem that we're now dealing with, okay? Whose ethics? Okay. The defense's argument, they say, wasn't a lack of ethics, right? This was a moral ethos that reflected the relationship between medicine and the state. Now, here's another quote that we have from Professor Dr. Fritz Lenz, who says, the individual personality cannot be the final goal of ethics. The people, the Volk as an organism, is the goal of our ethics. So that was the ethics that was being taught. When they talk about Germany, right, and they talk about the politicization of ethics, of medicine, what do we mean? It's not easy to get an entire country to go along with killing a whole group of people. It's not easy to wake up one morning and look at your neighbor who, you know, been going over asking for a cup of sugar all the time, every day. You've been, you know, your children have been playing with their children, but now all of a sudden they're the enemy. How do you do that? Now, I'll tell you, I grew up in a conservative Jewish family. I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week. I knew the Holocaust existed, but I never understood how until I learned about this. Until I learned about the politicization of medicine, until I learned about what actually happened. The idea in the shift of ethics from caring for the individual to caring for the nation, that shift, that idea where Hitler knew that he needed a solid argument to get people to go along with what he was doing, to buy into it. How do you do that? Well, there's a group of people and they're infecting the population. There's a group of people and they're inferior. Okay, why are they inferior? Who says they're inferior? Well, remember what we said before. When doctors say something, people tend to listen, right? We don't question it. We don't question what doctors say. Okay, well, how are you going to get that justification? Well, we need science to go along with it. So we're going to use this scientific idea of eugenics, right? Eugenics, which says there's this idea of better breeding. There are certain people that are, you know, inherently better than others. There are certain people who We know that when their genes come together, we put them with other people, they create a better race, right? Well, how do we know? Because science says so. And it's happening all over the world. It's not just here, it's happening all over the world. Happening in the United States, happening in England, right? Okay, so, well, what are we gonna do? Well, we're gonna start taking care of, we're gonna tell our doctors to start taking care of the state, the nation of Germany. That is the job of the doctors, and that's what we start teaching in our medical ethics curriculum. So when we teach this in our medical ethics curriculum, after Germany's defeat in World War I, Hitler starts playing off of the fears that Germany is a nation in decline, and he has a plan to return the country to former levels of greatness. And the key feature is using science and medicine to rid the nation of these unfit people, these degenerates, to build a better, stronger nation. So again, he starts with this idea of the disabled, but slowly but surely he moves on, right? He moves on, and eventually, as we know, this idea of moving on extends to other types of people. To do this, the task of the doctors becomes the single most important task of any profession in the nation of Germany. Any profession. That's how you wind up with the holder of the first chair of racial hygiene in Germany. Okay? People say the Nazis had no ethics, but Nazi Germany was one of the first countries to have a mandatory course in medical ethics. Germany was framed as a living, breathing organism with its own health and hygiene that had to be prioritized above all else. So when you look at that shift, caring for the individual to caring for the nation, we talk about an inflection point. There's your inflection point. There it is, okay? The state and medicine, these two, obviously, politics and medicine, very, very strong systems of power are coming together. And they're backed up by the legal system, and they're backed up by the propaganda machine. So everything's coming together to all coalesce. So when you look at it that way, it's hard to make the argument that the prosecution's trying to make. And that's what the defense is saying. But how could you blame the doctors? Because everything was pointing in the same direction. And the doctors were only doing what they were told to do. The doctors were doing not just what they were told to do, but what they truly believed to be the right thing. Because this was the moral ethos, okay? Minister to the strong and not the weak. That was the moral ethos within medicine, and that was the internal regulation in medicine. That was what they were supposed to do. That was what they were being taught to do. So Telford Taylor's opening statement continues, and he points the finger directly at scientific medicine because he says they failed to uphold the core responsibility of the profession. Go back, right? Okay, somewhere along the way, something got mixed up. And go back and look at the fundamental principle to first do no harm. Okay, that's what he talks about. And he says, he drills down on the fact that the politicization of medicine was an essential component of the Holocaust. The idea of medically sanctioned genocide was what led to the labeling, persecution, and eventual mass murder of those deemed unfit. And he argues that it was this symbiotic relationship, right, between politics and medicine that led to this gross abuse of power, where medicine was able to label, persecute, and murder. Because where was the system of checks and balances? How did we wind up in a situation where this was able to occur? And where physicians, who should be the ones protecting vulnerable populations, were the ones who were causing them harm. That's what Telford Taylor says. Somewhere along the way, something went wrong. And that's why we're here. Because there was a spiral. There was a spiral. And yes, there was a politicization of medicine. And yes, there was a relationship. He acknowledges that this happened. But his point is, It never should have happened. Something somewhere went horribly wrong, and we can't allow that to happen. We need to call that out. So how do we do that? How do we ensure physician accountability is there? How do we ensure that these physicians were saying, it wasn't us, it wasn't our fault. We were part of a larger machine. We were part of a larger system. How do we ensure that these physicians are held accountable? So then we have the idea that goes back to, are we putting the physicians themselves on trial, or are we putting Nazi ideology on trial? Why did we have this trial in the first place? Why did we put the Nazi doctors on trial separately from other war criminals? And if you go back and you look, we put the doctors on trial first. We felt that it was so important that we put them on trial before anybody else, after the original trial that I believe was the one that Einspruch stole. We put them on trial first, right? So we say, after all, they were not the military masterminds. This is what this quote is saying, right? So why are we treating them like the military masterminds if they were not, in fact, the ones that created all of this? Because the idea that Nazi ideology could infiltrate the sacred profession of medicine is so egregious that we have to call it out, and we have to hold it up for everyone, everywhere to see. Taylor uses this opportunity in the opening statement to tell you that this trial isn't just about the people, it's about the ideas. He boldly states here that this trial is about putting Nazi ideology on trial, and this is where he foreshadows what's to come in the judgment. It's where he tells you that, arguably more so than just putting people on trial here, the real impetus for what we're doing is to put the idea on trial. It's to do something to make sure that we prevent this idea from continuing, from repeating, and that we understand that the fact that Nazi ideology seeped into medicine is arguably the biggest issue as a profession. Doctors joined the Nazi profession more quickly and in larger numbers than any other profession. That is a big problem because, again, who do you go to when you have something wrong with you, when you're vulnerable, when you're sick, when you're hurt? So to break that trust, something needed to be done, and something serious needed to be done. And that's what he's telling you here. He's telling you that's why we're doing this. To me, this slide about moral courage and the power of the profession is ultimately the most important one when we're talking about current implications. Not just for medicine, not just for research, not just for medical practice, but for humanity and for moral leadership. Because that's where we dropped the ball. We dropped the ball when it came to moral leadership. Doctors are supposed to be leaders when it comes to morality, when it comes to other people looking at them as role models, okay? So he says here, its leaders lack the wisdom to foresee the consequences and the courage to stand firm in the face of threats. There were very few doctors who stood up and said no. There are very few researchers who stood up and said no. And in fact, when you look at what happened in terms of why did doctors join the profession in larger numbers and more quickly, it's because there were professional opportunities available to them after Jews were expelled from German-occupied territories. And it's also because there were opportunities that were available as a result of the concentration camps, prisoners being in concentration camps, so they could conduct whatever research they wanted with no guardrails. Why didn't more people stand up and say no? Why didn't more people have the courage to say no? Because there's not a lot of examples of people who did stand up and say no having any type of repercussions. So when we look at this and when we talk about kind of what happened and what went wrong, where were the people who were upstanders? And when we talk about now and we think about now, that's a takeaway that we need from this trial. We need to understand that it's our responsibility, again, to stand up and speak out when something is happening that we know is wrong. Hitler's famous quote, you National Socialist doctors, I cannot do without you for a single day, not a single hour. If not for you, if you fail me, then all is lost. Yes, Hitler was an orator, and the absolute primacy of the relationship between medicine and politics is very obvious here. We can see why people followed him, because he made them feel like he couldn't do anything without them. And so they went along with it because he gave them the impression, rightly so, that none of this would be a success if it wasn't for them. So when we afterwards found out all the atrocities that took place, it made sense. It made sense why all of this happened. And it made sense to put these people on trial, even though, again, they weren't technically the military masterminds. So when we hit the final paragraph of Telford Taylor's opening statement, the relationship between a physician and a patient is sacred, or at least it's supposed to be. Again, when you're sick, when you're vulnerable, God bless you, that's where you go, right? You go to the doctor, and you trust that they have your best interest at heart. It's at the heart of the relationship, whichever way you look at it. And the sanctity of that relationship was irrevocably broken during the Holocaust. The guardrails fell off. They were supposed to be in place to prevent something like this from happening. Nobody ever could have imagined that the doctors, the people that you trust the most to keep you safe, would have been the ones that perpetrated this much damage. This was a failure on a catastrophic level, on a personal level, on a professional level, on a human level, on a moral level. The physicians broke something during the Holocaust that to this day is still not fixed. The generational trauma, the distrust, and the mistrust in the medical profession is still there, and it is still very real. We still see this when you think about COVID and you think about the way in which people still very hesitant to do anything, to get injections, to get any type of care. There is still, to this day, almost 80 years later, a very strong distrust in the medical profession. Because we're supposed to be able to think that doctors at the heart of the profession are going to first do no harm, and that is not what happened. And it's not like it happened on a small scale. It happened on a large scale. It was not a few people who made decisions. It was an entire profession's worth of people. So what does that mean in terms of the appropriate guidelines for human experimentation? Here's where it shifts over to the closing argument that was given by Chief Prosecutor James M. McCaney. He presents a very clear divide between what is criminal and what is non-criminal. There's no question here. Did the subjects volunteer? Were they informed of the experiment's nature and hazards? If they did, great. No need to proceed any further. If they didn't, then the defendants committed a crime. This is very clear, very black and white, okay? We know that people in concentration camps did not consent to these experiments. Therefore, from the standpoint of were these people guilty or were they innocent, the decision is very clear. That solves one issue, okay? But that doesn't solve the other issue when we talk about guidelines. So again, two major points. We have to figure out guilty or innocent, and we have to figure out what are we going to do and how is this going to impact ethical guidelines in the future. So are there any universal standards? Because remember, the defense and the prosecution used the exact same argument in terms of, well, here are the historical guidelines. No, these are the historical guidelines. These are the ethical things we use. No, these are the ethical things we use. So what are we supposed to do? Because obviously, what we learned was there are no ethical guidelines that anybody's using. So the question then becomes, even though the main focus of the tribunal was on the behavior of the physicians, we don't actually have any real touch points that we can use. So we have to establish a universal set of ethical principles for human experimentation that would serve as an enforceable code of ethics. And that's how we come up with the Nuremberg Code. In terms of, again, the first point, we have August 20th, 1947. 16 of the 23 physicians were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 7 were sentenced to death. But Justice Taylor advocated for a larger ethical accounting of the medical profession in his opening statement. Rather than simply stopping there, the judgment at Nuremberg doesn't just stop with the verdict on the individuals at the trial. They realize, okay, we have to do more, we have to go further in order to actually make sure that this doesn't happen again. This becomes a pivotal moment within the history of research and medical ethics. The judges say, we're going to go further and we're going to establish a code of ethics. Now keep in mind, these judges are not ethicists, okay? They have no background really in this at all. But they say, okay, we're gonna establish this because we understand the significance of the testimony before us, the documentation, and the defense argued that it wasn't a lack of ethics, it was a transformation of ethics. So we need universal guidelines. This is great. They raise the consciousness of the global community. They move everything to the forefront of the public debate. Fantastic. The problem is, look at all of these questions that they raise, right? Because again, they're not ethicists. They don't have a background in this. So we have this issue here where we've created the publication of the Nuremberg Code. It's great. We have 10 points, starting with the voluntary consent is necessary for research, which is a direct response to what had taken place during the Holocaust. But practically speaking, it becomes very difficult to apply. So it's groundbreaking in that it forces governmental bodies to take a stronger stance, and it limits the autonomy of the medical profession. Because we've seen that when the medical profession was left to regulate themselves, it did not work out so well, okay? However, the problem is that it doesn't actually create anything that can be enforced. So what do we do here? What do we have, all right? We have something that the court has put out there that they can't enforce and doesn't offer any type of concrete way to go about doing this. So then the question becomes, why did the court do this? What was their purpose? Because the Western world reacts to the Nuremberg Code by saying it's a good code for barbarians, but an unnecessary code for ordinary physician scientists. So it's possible that the Nuremberg Code was meant to be incorporated as like common law, but I think that it's more likely that the purpose of the Nuremberg Code was to remind people that there needs to be guardrails. There needs to be a system of checks and balances, because that's what was missing in Nazi medicine, right? It wasn't supposed to be a comprehensive code of ethics. After the Nuremberg Code was published, we see the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, the Common Rule, all these other things, all these other codes of ethics that are published, except that the Nuremberg Code remains the seminal work, the Bible. That's what everybody winds up calling it. Even though everybody complains about it and everyone says, but we can't actually use it. There's no real way that we can use it because it doesn't serve any practical purpose. The court realized that. The court realizes that it was only after the Holocaust that people realized that there needed to be a way for society to hold physicians accountable for unethical conduct. Physicians have been held to this status of being above everybody else, and what they say is you know, it's law. We're always going to listen to what they say. But they also realize that they're not the ones that can come up with anything. They're not equipped to do that. So they're not going to immediately create anything as law, but it's a way to do something. And it's a way to encourage the international community to follow suit. It's a statement about the absolutely essential need to protect the human dignity of all people, above the promise of scientific advancement, because that's what was missing during the Holocaust. Doctors thinking they could do anything because they were God, and no one was going to stop them. They had the law on their side, they had the government on their side. It didn't matter. So even though the court says, we don't have the power, we know we don't have the power, we know we don't have the power to create something that's going to be universally enforceable, but we do have the power to create a call to action for the international community. And not only do we have the power to do it, we have the moral responsibility to do it. And so to me, that's the beauty of this trial. And that's the beauty of the Nuremberg Code. And that's the reason why almost 80 years later, it still carries so much relevance. This is Eva Moses Core. She was my friend. She was a Holocaust survivor. She was a survivor of Joseph Mengele's twin experiments. She was my inspiration. She was one of the strongest people I've ever met. She used to take 100 people to Auschwitz every year, and she used to walk them through the concentration camps. She would stop on the selection ramp, and she would show them the spot where she was ripped from her mother's arms after they asked her mother if she and her sister were twins. She used to walk us past the spot where she was experimented on. I was honored to know her. I was honored to learn from her. And the very first thing I did when I met her was promise that I would always tell her story. These are some quotes from her book, Surviving the Angel of Death, where she says, "I was just treated as a subject to experiment, not as a human being. I don't think there was one single effort to make us feel human. What I'm finding very difficult to understand is how any human being can treat another human being that way. So when I talk about ethics in medicine, I point that out. That did not only happen in Nazi Germany. That can happen in any society that values the medical research more than the human being that the research is conducted on. The simple thing to do is to say, if I were the human subject, would I want to be treated that way? And if the answer is no, you are doing something wrong. You have to change it. It's not that complicated. Put yourself for a very short time in the place of your subject, and then you will get all the answers." And she came up with her own code of medical ethics. And this is what she said. She said, again, it's very simple, right? Everyone's sitting here trying to come up with their code. What does this one say? Let's consult with these ethicists and these doctors and these lawyers. I think we should listen to the words of someone who lived it, the words of someone who went through it. And as I said, when I first started talking about this, I can talk until my face turns blue, and it's not going to mean nearly as much as the words of a survivor, right? And the words of somebody who experienced this herself. And it's my job, just like it was the court's job, to issue a call to action and to make sure that what we're doing is using the lessons of the Holocaust to create a more moral world and a more moral society. Because the one we live in now isn't doing such a great job. I can't pretend to have all the answers. This is the second part. I can't pretend to have all the answers. I don't. No one does. What I can do is make sure that we don't forget these lessons. And what I can do is I can suggest that recognizing the importance of the Holocaust in the history of research in medical ethics allows us as a society to develop a personal and professional ethos that values the dignity of the individual in a new paradigm that emphasizes the importance of developing a personal and professional moral ethos that guides us. Because I can't stand next to every single person and give them a pep talk or a speech before every instance that they may have where there's an ethical quandary, right? But what I can do is suggest that we learn from the way in which the moral compass of the Nazi doctors was corrupted by forces from outside of the medical profession, because that's still happening. right? There's outside forces that continue to affect not just people in the medical profession, but all of us, right? There's external forces that continue to affect the way our decision-making processes. So if understanding how physicians who abandoned their Hippocratic oath and replaced it with the oath they swore to Hitler, if they could transform from healers to killers, then we can all be influenced by outside forces. So that's why it's so essential to have the Ackerman Center. That's why it's so essential to learn from the Holocaust, to learn from history, because if we really want to make sure that we keep our promises, like the promise I made to Eva, then we have to learn, right? We have to develop a moral compass that guides us, no matter where we are, no matter what situations we're faced with. That's really the only thing we can do. So I leave you with that. I'm gonna skip over that. I leave you with that. This is my information. You can always email me if you have any questions. That is the website for my organization. This is the book, and that is the chapter, The Holocaust is an Inflection Point in the Development of Research Ethics, where the majority of this information came from. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or I'm happy to answer them, stick around afterwards, and I'm happy to answer any questions then as well.
We have time for a few questions, so raise your arm.
Thank you, a great presentation, very informative, you did a great job, thank you again. My question is, would you see our experience in the COVID pandemic as a triumph or a failure of the Nuremberg trials?
Very good question. So I'll tell you my personal thought on that. I'm not sure. Every time I answer this question, I always get people who disagree with me. So here's the issue with COVID. First and foremost, let me just say that there are two very different scenarios. The Holocaust did not have to happen, right? It was man-made, right? COVID was different. COVID happened, unfortunately, it was a global pandemic that was outside of our control. That being said, there's something called catastrophe ethics, and catastrophe ethics is what happens when something bad happens and everyone panics and we throw away everything that we know about ethics. And I will go back to this. There was just a revision, a 2024 revision of the Declaration of Helsinki, and you can see in this last bullet point here that one of the things that they included was to uphold the ethical principles stated in the Declaration during public health emergencies, even if urgent interventions are required. That is a direct response to COVID, because we did not do that. So one of the examples that I would give is in Italy, the Society of Anesthesiologists came out with this pronouncement that if you were over a certain age, it was either 62 or 63, you would not be entitled, when they were rationing ventilators and other forms of PPE, you would not be entitled to that past a certain age. And that sends a message to society about who we value and who we don't. So basically saying we don't value you if you're past a certain age. The thing to remember here is that when the crisis passes, you can't take that back, right? And again, so important to remember, not the same thing, motives are different, all of those things, right? Have to say that many times because otherwise people get on me about it. But I think, we have to understand that you can't come up with these arbitrary kind of decisions about whose life is worth more than whose. And I think that's really important. Now, I don't have a great solution. That is the other thing. Everyone's like, well, what would you have done? If I knew what to do, I would have gone straight to Anthony Fauci or the World Health Organization or whoever it was and been like, here's what you guys should do. I don't know. My best suggestion is to create some type, a bioethics committee, a panel, and evaluate everything on an individual level. Because I think that's when we get ourselves in trouble also, is when we try and kind of across the board say, this is what we're doing, everybody over this age, or everybody, We did it also with intellectual disabilities. In the United States, it turns out that there are still laws on the books that say certain things about people with intellectual disabilities and what they are or are not entitled to. So I think it's important. We need to be cognizant of these things, and when we are in a period of peace or stability, we need to go back and make plans, because it's important to be able to plan for these things so we don't turn to catastrophe ethics when something like that happens.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your wonderful talk. It was very inspiring, also very enlightening. I was wondering about your thoughts on how the tragedy of the Holocaust permeated, like you said, every sphere of life, basically, and also the medical profession. So you were mentioning that there was not, the fact was that there was not a lack of ethics, but a transformation of ethics. So how do you see this in combination with the fact that it was legal, so that sometimes what it's legal, it's not actually legitimate, and that how can that twist our moral compass?
So one thing that I always make sure that I talk about is just because something's legal does not make it ethical, which is why it's really important to make sure that we all have a strong moral foundation, moral compass, both personal and professional. For those of you who are interested in attending tomorrow's lecture, I talk about that in detail. Because, you know, if you have a strong moral compass, then, you know, you have a red flag that goes up when something happens and it doesn't seem ethical. In Nazi Germany, that was one of the things that allowed the Holocaust to happen at the level that it did, was because you had all of these systems of power that came together because Nazi ideology really kind of seeped its way into every aspect of daily living. So I will say that I do believe that medicine was the strongest force. It was the strongest factor, but it was backed up by the legal system, what we would consider, I guess, journalism, but what I would call then, you know, propaganda. It was in textbooks. I mean, you could not escape it. So it became something that was ingrained in every aspect of life. And so if it's ingrained in every aspect of life, it does start to seem like something that makes sense. And, you know, Hitler was very smart about the way in which he did this, because it's layered, right? It becomes layered on itself. So, you know, when science says something, or you have scientific theory of eugenics and racial hygiene, and then medicine's backing it up, and you've got the legal system that's backing that up, it does become something that, you know, it's everywhere, and you can't really escape it. And so it became much more difficult to fight it. And everything became intertwined. And then I think that, like, for a lot of people, it became easier to go along with. It just became easier to accept than to try and kind of go against this giant tidal wave. And so I think that that's something that we can really learn from, this idea of ethics being taught in a certain way. It's being taught not only as legal, but also as ethical. And that is, I think, one of the most troubling things that took place during the Holocaust.
We have time for one more question.
That was a wonderful lecture, thank you. My question is, do you think that the withholding of treatment in black men with syphilis by physicians in Tuskegee, Alabama, was comparable to the kind of atrocities that were committed in Germany?
So the quote that I used before from the Western world's response to the Nuremberg Code is very ironic, because that was said by an American researcher, while at the same time, you know, that was what was happening in America. So, you know, it was very easy, you know, in the United States, what was taking place was absolutely unethical medical research. And if you look at the history of research ethics, you find out about something like Tuskegee, and then another code is passed to respond to Tuskegee. but it doesn't, it's a pendulum, right? It's a pendulum swing. So then we say, okay, well, we really have to make sure that we're doing more internal oversight. And then you find out, let's just say, about AIDS research, and that the United States, there's pharmaceutical companies in the United States that are testing medication for AIDS treatment on, developing countries in Africa, but they're never going to see that medication because we're going to price it so far out of the reach of any of those people. So that's unethical. And then they say, okay, well, we're going to pass another law to try, or another code of ethics to try and fix that. And it's just this constant reactionary research ethical codes. And I think part of what we really need to be doing is not being so reactionary, but being proactive instead. Because honestly, I mean, I don't really think that you can compare too much to what was taking place during the Holocaust, because it was so horrible, and it was so, like I said, it was so egregious because there was no type of checks and balances at all. But there's so many examples of unethical research that I think people do because it's not explicitly covered in this code of ethics or explicitly covered in that code of ethics. And so to me, the only real way around that, like I said, is this idea of being proactive instead of reactive. And the only real way to do that is to try and develop this internal moral compass where people are doing things not because they have to, but because they actually believe it's the right thing to do. Without that, I don't think that, saying, well, there's a code here, or, something like that is enough, if that makes sense. It's kind of a cop-out answer, but if that makes sense.
Please join me now and thank one more time our wonderful speaker.